Stop begging for money. That was the first thing my dad said to me that Christmas evening in Westfield, Ohio, while the entire family sat around the long dining table, pretending we were something close to whole. The lights were warm, the house smelled like cinnamon and roasted ham, and everyone acted as if we were celebrating peace. Then my sister Bethany leaned back in her chair, smirked, and added her piece. She said it was so pathetic. The room shifted with a slow wave of nods, a quiet agreement that landed heavier than any shout could have. Mom did not look at me. Her silence felt like the final vote. I did not say a word. I did not remind them of the years I had helped them or the gentle messages I had sent earlier asking if they remembered the money they had promised to return. When things got better, I simply sat there, looking at the people I had once believed I belonged to, realizing in one long breath that I had never truly been seen as anything more than a resource they felt entitled to. And the strangest thing was how calm I felt inside. It was a stillness that usually comes right after a storm, except the storm was still happening around me. Before I go any farther, let me pause for a moment. I always like knowing what people are doing when they listen to stories like this. It makes the world feel a little closer, a little more human. So if you feel like it, share it in the comments later. When all of this happened, I was sitting at that table, feeling the air around my shoulders turn cold, even though the house was warm. That Christmas table was supposed to be a reminder of family. For years, I had played the part of the daughter who stayed calm, who kept the peace, who never demanded anything. When I had shared my lottery win a few years earlier, I had done it with the kind of hope only someone raised to believe in family can have. I told them I had come into some money and wanted to help. I never told them the full truth about what I had actually won. I told them I had at one point $2 million. What I really received was more than 10 times that amount. I thought keeping the larger number to myself would protect everyone from temptation. I see now how naive that was. The giving started small. David needed to cover a slow month in his construction business. Rowan, my brother, had fallen behind on some bills. Bethany, my sister, said her husband was expecting a promotion soon, and they only needed a few months to catch up. Mom said she needed a little cushion until the new year. I had believed each word. I thought generosity would come back around in gratitude, or at least respect. Instead, it quietly turned into an expectation. And the moment I asked for even a piece of what I had given, everything I knew about family broke. I sat at the table while the voices around me blended into a single low hum of judgment. The way their eyes slid off me made it clear they had already rewritten the story. In their version, I was asking for something I had no right to. I was the ungrateful one, the demanding one, the troublemaker. Mom lifted her glass as if nothing had happened and asked someone to pass the rolls. No one looked in my direction. I could have defended myself. I could have said that I had only asked for a portion of the money I had lent them because my boutique in Dublin, Ohio, needed extra inventory for the New Year rush. I could have reminded them that I had never once pressured them to return anything, but something inside me settled into a strange clarity. I understood that no explanation would change the way they responded to me. They were not reacting to my words. They were reacting to the idea that I had finally stepped outside the boundaries. They kept me in. I pushed my chair back. The legs scraped the wooden floor with a long, tired sound. Every head turned my way, not with worry or regret, but with a kind of tight impatience, as if I had interrupted their holiday rhythm. I walked out of the dining room and down the hallway lined with framed pictures of our family through the years. I did not stop to look at any of them. When I stepped outside, the cold air struck my face, sharp and honest. It felt cleaner than anything inside the house. The snow had stopped falling a few hours earlier, and the streetlights cast soft pools of light across the driveway. My car sat there the same way it always did during the holidays, as if waiting for me to be done performing the role I had practiced since childhood. I got in and closed the door. The quiet inside the car felt like another world. I took a long breath and let it out slowly. My hands were steady when I picked up my phone. I scrolled to the number I had memorized weeks earlier, not because I had expected tonight to go like this, but because a part of me had started to prepare for the possibility that my family might never see me as anything but convenient. The call connected. On the other end, Dorian Hale, the bank manager at Rivermark Community Bank in Columbus, answered with his usual calm voice. I told him exactly what I needed to say. Freeze the account. Final 21. Those were the words I had set up with him in advance, a security code and command phrase that would stop all activity connected to the shared permissions I had once given to my dad. A clean step backward, a boundary that no one in that house ever expected me to place. Dorian repeated my instruction back to me with the same professional tone he always used. He did not ask why. He did not need to. He told me it was done and wished me a safe evening. I hung up. For a moment, I just sat there with my phone in my lap, staring out at the quiet street. The breeze pushed a few loose flakes across the windshield, and the world seemed to hold still. I thought I would feel a rush of something fierce, anger or triumph or sadness. Instead, I felt nothing but the deep simplicity of a door closing behind me. A door I had kept open out of habit, not love. Inside the house, I could hear loud voices through the walls, chair scraping. My sister said something sharp. Dad complained. The noise rises like a wave. I wondered how long it would take them to realize that the safety net they had leaned on was no longer underneath them. And I wondered if any of them would stop to ask themselves how we even arrived at that moment. But the truth is, I already knew. People rarely question the comfort they take from someone else. They only question the moment that comfort disappears. I turned the key in the ignition and let the engine warm. For the first time that night, I allowed myself to feel the smallest tremor of grief. Not for the money or for the humiliation in front of the family, but for the version of myself who had believed that kindness always leads to closeness. That loyalty would be returned. That family would honor what they promised. As I backed out of the driveway, I did not look back at the house. I drove slowly through the neighborhood streets that had wrapped around my childhood. I passed the mailbox I helped paint when I was 7, the tree I used to climb with Rowan, the corner where I waited for the school bus. So many pieces of a life that made me who I was. Yet none of those memories followed me as I turned onto the main road. I thought about the boutique I had built from scratch. The shelves are waiting to be restocked. The customers who had started to recognize my face. The quiet pride I felt each morning unlocking the door and knowing the life I was building was mine. Not borrowed, not dependent, not shaped by anyone else's approval. That night marked the end of something I had held on to much longer than I should have. A script about a family that no longer fit who I had become. And as I drove into the quiet December night, I could feel the beginning of something else taking shape inside me. A story that was no longer about being the daughter who stayed small. A story about reclaiming what should never have been taken. I did not know then how far this would go. I did not know how many lies would unravel, or how quickly the fractures in my family would widen. All I knew was that the moment my dad called me pathetic, the moment my sister smirked and everyone nodded, something in me finally broke free. And that was the moment I stopped being afraid of what I might lose and started paying attention to what I still had the power to rebuild. I drove on, letting the quiet night settle around me like a blanket. I was finally allowed to pull over my own shoulders. The road ahead was dark and open and honest, nothing like the crowded dining room I had just walked out of. For a long stretch, I kept my eyes on the fading lines of the highway, letting the air inside the car stay still and cool. But eventually my mind drifted back, not to the dinner or the bank call, but to the year everything started shifting under my feet. It was 2019, the year I thought fortune had chosen me for something good. I had been working long hours back then, juggling part-time shifts and freelance orders, trying to piece together something stable enough to stand on. I remember waking up one morning with a headache from lack of sleep and an overdue bill on my kitchen table. I grabbed a lottery ticket on a whim from a gas station in Columbus because the clerk joked that the jackpot had gotten ridiculous. I almost tossed the ticket in my glove compartment and forgot about it. But the next morning when I checked the numbers, I felt the kind of shock that makes you sit down without meaning to. $10.8 million. After taxes, it would be less, but still enough to change the direction of a life. I stared at the ticket for a long time, waiting to feel something, like joy. It came in small waves, then fear, then hope. I did not tell anyone at first. Not my friends, not my coworkers, certainly not my family. I wanted to think, to breathe, to let the idea settle before I let it become real. For 2 days, I walked around with that secret in my pocket, feeling both lifted and unsteady, as if the world had suddenly become a thinner sheet of glass beneath my feet. On the 3rd day, I made an appointment, signed papers, and watched a stranger across a desk congratulate me with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. It still did not feel real. Money that large does not feel like something you own. It feels like something you borrow from whatever luck decides to look your way. I drove to Westfield a week later to tell my family. I practiced a dozen speeches in the car, but when I walked through the front door, Mom hugged me so tightly that everything inside me softened. Dad was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers and a tired look. Rowan was helping fix a door hinge. Bethany had just dropped by to return a slow cooker. The room felt full, but familiar. I thought that was the right moment. I sat them down and explained that something unexpected had happened. I told them I had come into a little over $1.2 million and that I wanted to help all of us breathe a little easier. I did not say $10.8 million. I did not mention the rest. I told myself it was because I wanted to keep things simple, that I did not want to draw attention or jealousy or worry. But the truth was a little deeper. I wanted to give without ruining the balance of who we were supposed to be to each other. Mom cried almost immediately. Dad let out a long breath, like he had been holding his lungs tight for months. Rowan hugged me and said he was proud of me. Bethany clapped her hands against her thighs and said, "Now we can all stop drowning." It was a moment that looked like gratitude on the surface. The warmth in the room felt real. I held on to that. For a few weeks, things were calmer than they had been in years. Dad talked about catching up on some business expenses. Mom said she might finally schedule the dental work she had been postponing. Rowan promised that once he paid off a small debt, he could help Dad with bookkeeping, maybe lighten the load. Bethany talked about a new daycare for her kids. I wanted to believe that I had done something right, that the money was helping us all move forward. The first time someone asked to borrow a portion of it, it did not feel strange. Dad pulled me aside one evening and explained that the construction company had hit another slow patch. He spoke quietly, not sternly, just tired. He said if he could just get through the next month, everything would even out. I wrote him a check without hesitation. It felt good. It felt like purpose. A week later, Rowan asked if I could help him cover a few bills until he got his next commission. He looked embarrassed, scratching the back of his neck the way he did when he was trying to mask nerves. I assured him it was fine. The family does what it can. That was the thought running through my head at the time. Family over everything. Family holds the net. Then Mom asked. She said the dental work had turned out more expensive than she expected. She told me she hated asking, that she never imagined needing help from her own daughter. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue and whispered that she felt like a burden. I held her hand and told her not to think like that. I meant every word. Bethany's request came a little later. She said her husband was expecting a big promotion in the spring, and with that raise, they could pay me back everything they owed. She asked for time. I gave her more than she asked for. Each request came with promises spoken softly, wrapped in love, delivered with the kind of sincerity that makes you feel selfish for even hesitating. I never questioned any of them. I never wrote anything down. I never added up the totals. I did not keep records because I trusted their voices, their intentions, the shared history that felt too strong to break. Months passed. Seasons changed. Life settled into a new normal. Every few weeks, someone in the family needed something. A bill, a setback, a gap to fill. I said yes. Always yes. Not because I felt pressured, but because I thought generosity had a way of circling back. I believed that giving would bring us closer, that money was just a tool, and love was the thing that mattered. But there was a shift at some point, and I felt it like a tiny crack under the surface. It happened the day Dad stopped explaining what he needed the money for. He just asked. No story, no context, just the expectation that I would handle it, and I did. But the tone was different. Something about it made me uneasy. Then Rowan called one afternoon And instead of asking if it was a good time, he launched straight into the amount he needed. He talked about it like we were making a transaction at a bank. No tremor of embarrassment in his voice. No pause. It was as if we had slipped into roles I did not realize we were acting in. I was the one who provided. They were the ones who received it. That was the structure, and no one questioned it. The moment that stayed with me the longest came from Mom. She called to chat about her garden, and then casually mentioned needing a little extra for a home repair. I asked her what had happened, and she brushed the question aside. She said it was nothing, that I did not need to worry about details. The way she said it made something twist deep in my chest. I knew then that we had crossed a quiet line. Asking has become a habit. Giving has become my duty. I remember sitting on the couch that evening in my small apartment, holding my phone long after the call ended. I looked around the room at all the things I had bought with my own hard work before any lottery money ever came into my life. The mismatched furniture, the old lamp, the chipped coffee table. None of it was new. None of it was impressive. But it was mine. Built from years of effort, and yet somehow, I had allowed myself to believe that I owed more to everyone around me simply because they were my family. I did not resent them then. Not yet. I told myself that they would pay me back when things stabilized, that this was temporary, that they appreciated what I had done, but the truth had already begun to form in subtle ways. I saw it in their eyes when they talked about the money. There was no longer any surprise or gratitude. There was only an assumption, a silent understanding that I would say yes no matter what. By the time a year had passed, I had grown used to the rhythm of it. Requests coming, me responding. No one mentioned repayment. I began to wonder if they even remembered the promise of paying me back, but I pushed that thought away because it felt disloyal to even question their intentions. Family loyalty was a language I had been raised on. It was a reflex. Looking back now, I can see exactly where it tipped. I can see the shift in their tones, the weariness in my own voice, the early signs that trust was becoming an obligation. But in 2019, standing at the edge of a new life with more than $10 million in the bank, all I wanted was to be generous, to do the right thing, to believe that good fortune, when shared, strengthens the bonds that matter most. I did not know then that generosity without boundaries can slowly turn into a story you no longer recognize, a story where you become something other than a daughter or a sister. You become the person who fixes everything, the one who makes the worries disappear. And once people grow used to having their fears erased, they forget that you are carrying weight too. If I had understood that earlier, maybe the Christmas table in Westfield would have looked different. Maybe I would have spoken up before the silence carved me out of the picture. But at the start of all this, all I felt was hope. I really believed that sharing my luck would bring us closer. Instead, it was the thing that slowly drove us apart. That truth only became clear years later, after every line had been crossed, and the night came when my dad called me pathetic, in front of everyone. But back in 2019, before any of that, I was simply a daughter trying to do right by the people she loved, holding on to a belief that would eventually turn into the very thing that broke us. I was simply a daughter trying to do right by the people she loved, holding on to a belief that would eventually turn into the very thing that broke us. That truth settled somewhere in the back of my mind as the years between 2019 and 2022 unfolded piece by piece, each moment small enough to overlook, but heavy enough to leave a mark once. Everything came crashing down. At the time, I did not see the pattern forming. I only saw individual requests, individual needs, each one sounding reasonable on its own, each one wrapped in the familiar voices of the people who had shaped my entire life. The first call in that long stretch came from Rowan. It was early spring in 2019. I was in the parking lot of a grocery store in Columbus, loading bags into the backseat of my car, when the phone rang. Rowan rarely called unless something was wrong. His voice carried the same old mix of confidence and strain he had perfected over the years. He told me things had been tight lately, and he just needed a little help to get through the month. He said it was only temporary, that he would pay me back as soon as his next commission came in. I believed him. I always believed him. So I transferred the amount he asked for and did not think twice. It felt like helping him breathe. A few weeks later, Bethany reached out. She asked if I had time to meet her at a coffee shop near her house in Westfield. When I walked in, she already had her hands wrapped around a half-finished latte and a stack of mail on the table. She looked up with a smile that did not quite hide the worry in her face. She explained that her husband was right on the edge of a big promotion, and once it came through, they would be in a much better place. She asked if I could lend her enough to cover a few unexpected costs until his new salary started. She said it would only be for a little while. She said they would make it right. I did not ask for details. I slid the money her way and hugged her goodbye. Dad waited until late summer. I remember it was a humid evening in Westfield, and he asked me to stop by the house. Mom was upstairs folding laundry and the television was playing quietly in the living room. Dad sat at the kitchen table where he always handled his paperwork. He looked older than I remembered. He told me the construction business had hit another slow cycle and he needed a small cushion to get through it. He called it a temporary setback. He said the word temporary more than once, and each time he said it, his eyes avoided mine. Still, I said yes. It felt almost automatic. I wrote the check and left it on the table beside his paperwork. He gripped my hand and thanked me. I believed he meant it. The months that followed felt like a slow drip. Every time life shifted for one of them, it somehow circled back to me. The requests came in intervals, never close enough together to raise suspicion, but steady enough to form a rhythm. Rowan needed to fix his car before a work trip. Bethany had a medical bill her insurance did not fully cover. Mom said the water heater was making strange noises, and she was worried it might break. Dad said a vendor had delayed payment, and it put him behind again. And each time, without hesitation, I stepped in. Looking back, I can see how my own silence played a part in the structure that formed around me. I never asked them to sign anything. I never wrote down amounts or dates. I never reminded them of what they promised to return. I never even hinted that some of the money was supposed to come back eventually. The idea of asking for repayment felt strange, almost rude, like violating some unspoken rule of loyalty. I did not want to seem greedy or controlling. I did not want to shift the way they saw me. So I said nothing. There was one moment, though, that should have told me everything I needed to know. It was late in 2020. A cold November afternoon. I was sitting in my apartment in Columbus, legs tucked under a blanket, rain tapping against the windows. Bethany called out of the blue. She jumped right into her story about needing help covering tuition for her oldest child. She talked fast and breathlessly, as if she had been rehearsing what to say. When she finished, I asked her gently if she still planned on paying me back the money from the spring. She paused for only a second before saying she did not remember owing anything. Not in a rude way, just in a simple, matter-of-fact tone, as if the entire conversation from before had been erased. I felt the breath catch in my chest. I reminded her of the coffee shop meeting, the stack of mail, the promotion her husband was expecting. She laughed softly and said she could not recall any of that. She mentioned she had been under a lot of stress lately. Then she changed the subject entirely and asked again for help. I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, staring at the rain sliding down the glass. It struck me then how easily her memory had dropped something that had felt so weighty to me. I told her I needed to think about it. She sounded surprised, maybe even a little offended, but she did not say anything more. When we hung up, I stayed on the couch for a long time. Not angry, not hurt, just quietly aware that a shift had taken place. A small but meaningful breaking in the pattern. For the first time, I knew that the promises they made had never really been promises at all. I still did not ask for repayment. Even after that moment, I could not bring myself to confront her or anyone else. I told myself that she had simply forgotten, that people get overwhelmed, that stress makes memories blurry. I chose explanations that preserved the idea I wanted to believe, the idea that my family was not taking advantage of me, that the generosity I offered still meant something to them. When Dad asked for help again a few months later, his tone was more direct. He talked to me as if he were talking to an accountant. He listed the amount he needed and the date he needed it by. There was no story attached, no expression of guilt or gratitude, just the expectation that I would understand and comply. I told him I would do what I could. and I did. Afterward, I sat in my car in the driveway for nearly 10 minutes trying to understand why the shift in his tone bothered me. But then I pushed the thought away and walked back inside, telling myself not to make things bigger than they were. My connection with Rowan followed a similar path. He used to check in on me, ask about my work, tell me about his week. Gradually, those conversations faded. Instead, he would send brief messages asking if I had time to move money around for him. He called one day asking for help covering a deposit he needed for a business investment. He talked to me in the same tone Dad had used. Firm. Expected. No space left for me to say no. I transferred the amount and wished him luck. He did not say thank you. That was when I realized thank you had been missing for some time. There was a part of me that still felt proud I could help. The money seemed like a chance to lift all of us. I never imagined it would twist into something else. The more I offered, the less I seemed to be seen as a daughter or sister. Instead, I became the person who fixed the gaps, who solved the problems, who made emergencies disappear. Giving had once made me feel connected, but eventually it made me feel invisible. By 2022, the requests had become predictable. There were patterns in the timing, patterns in the tone, patterns in the way no one asked how I was doing or whether helping them put me at risk. They assumed I had endless resources and endless willingness, and because I had never corrected that assumption, it kept growing. Then came the moment I could never shake. It was a midsummer afternoon. The heat was thick and heavy, and I had driven to Westfield to attend a small family barbecue Mom had planned. People were moving in and out of the kitchen. The smell of grilled corn drifted through the air. I went into the living room to drop my purse on the couch and overheard Dad talking with a neighbor. He mentioned that it was helpful having extra funds available from time to time, and that his daughter did what she could. The neighbor said something polite in return. David responded with a small laugh and the words that settled into my chest like a stone. He said that was what kids were for. I stood there frozen for a moment, not because the words were harsh, but because they were delivered so casually, as if I were simply a resource built into the structure of his life, not a person, not a daughter, a function, a convenience. I did not confront him. I did not walk out. I just stepped back into the kitchen and helped Mom carry a bowl of salad outside. Maybe that was the real turning point. Maybe that was the moment when the truth finally took shape. But even then, even with all the signs lined up in front of me, I still did not ask for anything to be returned. I still left every unspoken promise untouched. It felt easier to keep the peace than to acknowledge what was really happening. It felt easier to live inside the version of the story where my giving still meant something to them. I held on to that version longer than I should have, all the way until the year I opened my boutique and finally needed something back from them. Only then did everything I had ignored rise to the surface. Only then did I understand that the promises they made had never been promises, designed to be kept. They were just words that made asking easier. If I had been willing to see it sooner, maybe I could have protected myself. But at the time, I loved them, and loving them meant trusting their intentions more than my own uneasy instincts. That loyalty felt like the right thing to cling to. I did not know yet that it was also the thing that would make the next few years crumble in ways I never expected. That truth stayed quiet in me as 2022 faded into 2023. And I finally let myself imagine a life that did not revolve around stepping in for everyone else. I had been saving a portion of my winnings aside for something I could build on myself, own. Something that was mine in a way nothing else had been. That was the year I decided to open my boutique in Dublin, Ohio. It started with a small storefront tucked between a bakery and a nail salon on Bridge Street. The windows were dusty when I first saw them, and the inside smelled like a mix of old wood and forgotten hopes. The floor creaked in certain spots, and the lighting flickered when I turned it on, but there was a charm to it, a quiet potential. I remember unlocking the door for the first time and feeling a tiny spark of excitement, something I had not felt in a long while. It was the same feeling I used to get as a child when I opened a new box of crayons, a sense of possibility. I spent the first month sanding shelves, painting walls, choosing display tables, and learning how to assemble furniture without losing my patience. I ordered local artwork and handmade home goods, mixed pieces from Ohio creators, with a few curated items I found on trips. I wanted the store to feel warm and personal, like stepping into a place where someone cared about texture and light and comfort. I named it the Willow Fern, a name that came to me one morning while drinking coffee and watching the wind move through the trees outside my apartment. The startup work was far more complicated than I had expected. I had to meet with suppliers, learn inventory software, negotiate shipping delays, and file more paperwork than I thought a single business could require. I had to fight self-doubt nearly every day. Even with the financial cushion I had set aside, I felt the pressure of trying to build something meaningful without leaning on anyone else. I wanted it to succeed because it represented something I had lost along the way. It represented who I was before the requests and the quiet withdrawals from who I was hoped to become. She was 29, sharp, thoughtful, and carried a natural warmth that made customers feel seen the moment they stepped inside. I met her during an interview at a coffee shop and knew right away she would be the kind of steadiness I needed in the store. She asked insightful questions about the boutique and listened carefully when I explained my vision. Her presence made me feel less alone in the process. The morning of the soft opening, I woke up at 5:30 in the morning with my heart racing. I lay in bed for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of my apartment, then forced myself up and into the shower. I kept thinking about how many people had failed when trying to start something new. I wondered if I was making a mistake by trying to build this dream without asking for help from anyone. But when I unlocked the door to the Willow Fern that morning and the early light filtered, no one could take it from me. No one could claim it. The first day was slow. A few curious people came in from the bakery next door. A couple of college students browsed the candles for a while. A mother and daughter walked through and complimented the artwork, but left without buying. I tried to remind myself that slow days were normal, that businesses grew in steps, not leaps. But by the end of the week, my confidence had taken several hits. Foot traffic was inconsistent. Social media posts were getting lost in the noise. Inventory was expensive. Every night I went home exhausted, wondering if I had made a mistake. One Friday afternoon, after a particularly slow morning, I stepped into the back room and let out a quiet sigh. Nora followed me a moment later. She leaned against the counter and studied my face the way someone does when they are trying to gauge how honest they can afford to be. "You know," she said gently, "this is how every good store starts. A trickle before a steady stream. People need time to get familiar. Give them time." Her confidence in my store almost threw me off balance. I had not expected a stranger to see me with more faith than my own family ever had. For a moment, I just stood there, letting her words settle in the air between us. It reminded me that support does not always come from the people you expect. Sometimes it comes from the ones who walk through the door at exactly the right time. I kept working. Every day I unlocked the door. Every day I rearranged displays, updated spreadsheets, responded to messages, and tried to find ways to breathe new life into the space. The work grounded me. It felt cleaner than the complicated exchanges with my family. When I was in that store, surrounded by shelves I had sanded myself and the scent of candles I had chosen, with intention, I felt closer to the version of myself I had forgotten. Even when things were tight financially, I refused to use the money I had given my family. I told myself that the boutique had to stand on its own feet, just like I needed to. If I was ever going to understand what I was capable of, it could not be built on borrowed ground. I kept dipping into the portion of my lottery winnings I had saved for myself, always careful to keep that separation clear. I had not asked for a single dollar back from my family, and I still did not plan to. Not then. By autumn, the Willow Fern began to see a shift. Customers returned. New ones found us. A local blogger wrote a small feature about the handmade pieces and the cozy atmosphere. One Saturday in October, the store was so full I could hardly move behind the counter. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the front window, smiling in a way I had not seen since before 2019. It was a quiet moment, but a powerful one. My store was alive. People wanted to be there. It was working. But success has a way of showing you the next gap. The more customers came in, the more inventory I needed. The more inventory, the more upfront costs. I sat The numbers were not alarming, but they told a clear truth. To keep growing at this pace, I needed a steadier flow of working capital. Nothing huge, just enough to buy in larger batches and keep margins healthy. For the first time since opening the store, I felt the weight of the money I had poured into my family. I knew how much I had given them. Even though I never wrote anything down, I carried those amounts in the back of my mind, like quiet notches on a tree trunk. I thought briefly about all the checks I had written and all the transfers I had sent. Not with bitterness, just with the sudden recognition that there was a difference between choosing to help and being expected to. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. The boutique lights were dim, casting soft shadows against the shelves. It was peaceful. It was mine. But it needed more than hope to keep going. It needed stability. It needed planning. It needed the kind of foundation I had spent years handing out one request at a time. Time. Nora came in from the back with a box of candles she had finished labeling. She set it down and asked if everything was all right. I told her the truth, in the simplest version. The store with the demand. She nodded and said something that startled me with its clarity. She told me that people with creative vision often underestimate how much support they need until the moment they cannot move forward without it. Her word. I tried to imagine what it would look like to ask my family for that kind of support. Not money, just effort, encouragement, belief. Then I realized I had never experienced that from them in any consistent way. Not the dreams in mine. That night, I lay awake thinking about everything I had built and everything I still needed. The store was not failing. It was blooming. But it needed water, and I needed to decide where that water would come from. I still did not want to cross the line into asking for the money back. Not yet. Not when I had chosen to believe that my gifts were unconditional. But part of me, the part that had grown steadier since opening this store, began to wonder if it was really so wrong to expect something in return, after all. This time, I pushed the thought away again, the same way I had pushed away every uncomfortable truth before. It was easier to fall asleep believing the store would eventually find its own stability. Still, the awareness was there, a seed planted quietly in the back of my mind, a recognition that for the first time in years, my future was tied to something I was building rather than something I was giving away. The willow fern had potential, real potential, but potential could not grow without nourishment. I was beginning to understand that the question was not whether my family owed me anything. The real question was how long I could keep pouring from a well they had never helped refill. I closed my eyes with that thought, lingering like a soft hum. When morning came, the store would be waiting, and somewhere inside me, a shift was taking place that I was not yet ready to name. I woke the next morning with the same hum in my chest, a quiet shift that felt like the early crack in a frozen lake. Nothing dramatic on the surface, just a thin, spreading line that meant something underneath was finally moving. I got ready for the day at the store, opened the blinds, lit the soft cedar candle near the register, and tried to fall back into the rhythm I knew. But the numbers from the night before stayed with me. They hovered at the edges of my thoughts as customers browsed and came and went, as Nora chatted with them about holiday gifts, as the door chimed over and over. By late afternoon, when the foot traffic slowed, I stood behind the counter, looking at the small stack of invoices I needed to pay. I felt a tightening in my chest. It was not fear, not exactly. It was more like realization. The willow fern had reached a stage where it was growing too fast for the slow, financial drip I had been relying on. If I wanted to keep the shelves full through the winter and early spring, I needed a little more flexibility, just enough to move with the momentum the boutique was finally building. And that was when the thought I had pushed aside for months rose back up again, this time unwilling to leave. All the money I had given over the years, the endless small rescues, the quiet transfers, the promises that had drifted away like smoke. It was not that I suddenly wanted everything back. I only needed a fraction, a piece, something to steady the store that was becoming my life's work. I sat alone at the counter long after Nora left for the evening. I stared at my phone as if the numbers on the screen might rearrange themselves into something easier. Instead, they stayed the same. So did the truth. For the first time in my life, I needed help. Not a gift, not a handout. Just the return of a portion of my own money. It took me 2 days to build the courage to send the first message. It was simple. I kept it polite, almost apologetic. "Hey, Mom. Hope things are going well. The store is growing faster than expected, which is great, but I am trying to manage inventory for the next season. I wondered if you and Dad might be able to return a small portion of what I lent over the years. Nothing urgent, just asking." I must have read it 20 times before pressing send. My thumb hovered over the screen so long it went numb. When I finally sent it, the rush of anxiety that followed made me feel foolish. This was my money. My own generosity. Why was I trembling like I had done something wrong? Mom responded that evening. Her message came in 3 long paragraphs that did not answer a single thing I had asked. She wrote about the rising cost of groceries and how my dad's business had been struggling this season and how stressful the holidays were. She wrote about feeling overwhelmed. She wrote about hoping I understood how much they appreciated everything I had ever done. What she did not write was yes, or no, or even maybe. When I read her message, I sat very still for several minutes. I waited to see if she would send anything else, perhaps something more direct, something helpful. But that was it. A cloud of words with no structure, no intention, just a soft reminder that her needs always filled the space where my needs tried to. Live. The next day I called her. I knew texting would only invite more avoidance. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was overly bright, like she had prepared for this call. "I got your message, honey. I have been thinking about it a lot." I waited. She let out a small sigh. "It just is not a good time. Your dad is overwhelmed. Rowan has been struggling again, and Bethany's husband did not get the promotion they thought he would. Money is tight all around. You know how it is." I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. "I only need a small portion, Mom. Not even a tenth of what I gave. Just enough to cover new inventory for the store." She hesitated. I heard her breath catch, just slightly, and then the familiar guilt slipped into her voice like it had been waiting on her. "Tongue, I do not understand why you would ask for this now. We never expected anything back when you so generously helped us. It almost feels like you are punishing us for falling on hard times." Punishing. The word landed wrong. Sharp. Cold. "Mom, I am not punishing anyone. I am asking because I need it. I know you think you do, sweetheart, but money has always made you anxious. That is why we never pressured you with anything. We just wanted you to feel secure. Asking for money like this, it is not like you. It worries me. It worries your dad, too." Then she lowered her voice, soft and trembling. "I hope nothing is wrong with you. You know you can always talk to me." I closed my eyes. There it was, the old tactic. Concern disguised as correction. Love disguised as shame. I wanted to scream, but I did not. Instead, I let a long silence stretch between us, until she said she needed to start dinner and would call later. She never did. 3 days passed before I heard from my dad. He called without warning. No hello, no warm-up, he went straight into it. "Your mom tells me you want money back. Is that true?" I gripped the phone and forced myself to breathe slowly. I explained the store, the growing demand, the need for inventory. I kept my voice calm. I told him I was not demanding anything. Just asking. There was a long pause, and then he let out a low, disappointed breath. "I never thought I would hear this from you." He sounded almost wounded. "You were always the one who understood that family stands together. You never acted like money mattered more than loyalty." "David," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I am not choosing money over loyalty. I am asking for help. It is still my money. I gave it with good intentions, but I need some of it now." He clicked his tongue in disappointment, a sound I recognized from childhood, a sound he used when I messed up at something he believed I should have mastered. "Asking for money back," he said slowly, "is the same as announcing that everything you ever did was conditional. What does that say about you? What does that say about your heart?" Something inside me cracked then. Not loudly, but like a hairline fracture that changes the entire structure beneath it. I realized he had never seen what I did for them as generosity. He saw it as an obligation, a role I was supposed to perform without question. I ended the call before he could say anything else, because I could feel my voice starting to shake. I went to the store that day with a heaviness in my chest that I could not set down. I rearranged displays without really seeing them. I answered customer questions automatically, and when Nora asked if everything was okay, I lied and said I was just tired. That night, lying in my bed, staring at the ceiling, the truth finally surfaced with an unmistakable clarity. The moment I asked for anything, even a small piece of what I had given, I stopped being who they needed me to be. I broke the script. I stepped outside the role of the reliable giver, the steady one, the quiet daughter who never disrupted the balance. By asking for my own money, I had committed a kind of betrayal in their eyes. But there was one more layer. Christmas was coming, and despite everything, I knew I needed to say it to their faces. Not through messages, not through calls. In person, I needed them to see that I was not ashamed of asking for something that belonged to me. I needed to look at them and tell the truth without letting guilt twist my voice. So I made the decision. I would go to the Christmas dinner. I would sit at that table. I would remind myself I had a right to my own voice, even if they wanted to drown it out. The days leading up to Christmas felt colder than usual. The sky over Dublin stayed gray and low. Customers came in with armfuls of shopping bags and whispered about weather forecasts. I wrapped candles and scarves and small ceramic dishes, all while carrying the quiet awareness that something irreversible was approaching. 2 nights before Christmas, while closing the store, I caught my reflection in the front window. I looked older somehow, not worn down, but sharpened, like someone who had finally stopped looking for permission to exist. I turned off the lights, locked the door, and walked out into the cold, knowing that whatever happened at that Christmas table, I would not be the same person walking in. I would not be the same person walking out either. That thought followed me all the way to the driveway after the Christmas dinner, still ringing in my ears as I stepped into the cold Ohio air. I felt the weight of every word that had been thrown at me. The looks, the silence, the tightening in my throat I refused to show. But my hands were steady when I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. The engine of my car clicked softly in the quiet night. I sat inside, shut the door, and let the silence wrap around me like a thin sheet of glass. I inhaled once, slow and full, then pressed the contact at the top of my recent call. The phone rang just once before he answered. My bank manager spoke in the same calm tone he always used, as if this were any other weekday conversation. He asked if everything was all right. I told him my name, verified my identity, and spoke the words that had been sitting in my chest for weeks, waiting for their moment. I said, "Freeze the account. Final 21. There was a brief pause on his end, just the sound of fingers typing. Then he confirmed the request in clear, measured sentences. He explained that the freeze would take effect immediately, and that any linked cards or automated withdrawals connected to the account would be temporarily disabled. There was no technical jargon, no complicated back and forth, just a simple confirmation that the cord had been cut. When the call ended, the quiet inside the car felt different. Not empty, not relieved, more like the sound of snow falling. Soft, cold, final. I started the engine. The headlights lit the thin crust of ice on the edges of the driveway. Inside the house behind me, I could hear faint echoes of voices. Laughter. Chair moving. Someone is closing a cabinet. The world I had stepped out of continued on without missing a beat. Halfway down the street, my phone buzzed, then buzzed again. And again. I did not look. Not yet. I drove back toward Dublin in a slow, steady line, the hum of the tires against the asphalt settling my pulse. The Christmas lights along the houses blurred through the edges of my vision, little bursts of color against the dark. Families inside those homes were probably sitting together, sharing pie, opening gifts, telling stories. I wondered briefly if they understood how fragile those moments were, how the smallest crack could change everything. By the time I reached the highway, my phone had buzzed more than 10 times. I ignored every vibration. I knew what was happening without seeing a single message. Someone's card had already been declined. I imagined the scene playing out in real time. My sister Bethany tried to place an online order for some unnecessary item she did not need. The card flashing red on the screen. Rowan, maybe Dad is attempting to transfer funds for another one of his short-term fixes. The sudden block. The confusion turned into irritation. The irritation turning into accusation. None of them would assume the bank had made a mistake. They would know immediately where the freeze came from. And that was exactly why I did not check my phone. I did not want to see their reactions. Not yet. Not until my mind had settled into the reality I had chosen. By the time I pulled into the lot outside my apartment building, the phone buzzing had slowed but not stopped. I sat for a moment with my hands still resting on the steering wheel. The night was quiet, except for a distant dog barking and the faint hum of a heater running in one of the units nearby. The world outside kept moving, but inside my chest, everything felt suspended, as if waiting to see what shape I would take next. I finally picked up my phone and looked at the screen. 22 messages, 7 missed calls, 2 voicemails. I did not open any of them. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat and stepped out of the car. The air stung a little as I walked up the stairs to my apartment. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and turned on the small lamp by the sofa. The warm light filled the room gently, without questions or judgment. My apartment smelled faintly of the pine candle I had burned earlier in the day. It was grounding, familiar. Mine. I hung up my coat, kicked off my shoes, and stood for a long moment in the quiet, letting the tension leak from my shoulders. My body felt lighter and heavier at the same time, like something inside me had finally exhaled, but had not yet decided what to inhale next. My phone buzzed again from the counter where I had set it. This time it was a call. I let it ring. I knew the tone my dad would use. Outrage wrapped in righteousness. Disbelief wrapped in disappointment. Accusation designed to sound like concern. He specialized in conversations where he cast himself as the victim of the consequences he created. I walked away from the phone. I made tea. I changed into warm socks. I tidied the living room in small motions that felt steady and real. Every vibration from the phone became background noise, like distant thunder with a storm I no longer intended to walk into. Eventually, curiosity nudged at me. Not enough to open the messages, but enough to turn the phone back over. The preview lines were visible on the lock screen. Bethany's message began with, "What did you do?" Rowan said my card is not working to fix it. David's preview line was longer and angrier, demanding an explanation. Mom's was the only gentle one, though I knew her softness always carried an edge. Here read, "Can we please talk? We are very worried." Worried, a familiar word, one they used every time I stepped outside the lines they drew for me. I locked the phone without opening anything. The tea warmed my hands as I settled onto the sofa. The window beside me showed a thin layer of frost forming on the edge of the glass. Outside, the world looked still, quiet enough for the truth to come up without shattering anything. I had cut the last thread connecting me to the version of them that used me without ever seeing me. The freeze was not revenge. It was a boundary, a line drawn after years of silence, a choice to no longer let my generosity be treated like a pipeline they were entitled to. My heart pounded softly, not in panic, but in recognition, a realization that the moment I asked for something real from them, they pushed me away. And the moment I stopped being useful, they showed me exactly who they were. I took a slow sip of tea. It steadied me. The phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from the bank confirming the freeze had been fully processed. It was done. I leaned back into the sofa cushions. For the first time all day, I felt an unexpected quiet settle into my chest. Not peace exactly, but clarity. I knew what the freeze meant. I understood the fallout that was already starting in that house back in Westfield. I knew I had stepped into a moment that could not be undone. A moment that cut through years of patterns as cleanly as a blade through a knot. And sitting there in my apartment, with the warm mug in my hands, and the distant ringing of my phone fading into nothing, I finally admitted something I had tried to avoid for years. I was done being their source. I was done carrying the weight they never acknowledged. I was done letting guilt decide my choices. I had frozen more than an account that night. I had frozen the story they kept rewriting around me. That was the thought that stayed with me as I turned off the lamp and let the darkness fill the room. The night felt different now. Heavier, but honest. And as I lay down, letting the noise of the world fall away, I knew I had crossed a threshold I could never walk back over. Whatever came next would start here, in this quiet, in this break, in this cold, necessary stillness before the rest of the truth finally surfaced. I did not know how fast the consequences would spread, or how quickly my family would rebuild a story where I was the villain. But the shift began almost immediately. The first sign came the next morning. I was sweeping the floor of the willow fern before opening when my phone lit up, with a message from a number I barely recognized. It was an old neighbor from Westfield, someone I had not spoken to in years. Her text was short and strange. She asked if I was all right. She said she had heard some upsetting things. Then she said if I ever needed to talk, she was there. I stared at the screen for a long moment. People do not send messages like that unless someone has already told a version of a story. I typed a polite reply, thanked her, and said I was fine, but the pit in my stomach tightened. A few hours later, as customers drifted in and out, Nora stepped into the back room where I was unpacking a shipment of scarves. She had a hesitant look on her face, the kind people get when they're deciding whether to tell you something or spare your feelings. She said someone she knew from church, a woman named Lena who lived in Westfield, had mentioned my name that morning. The look in Nora's eyes told me everything before she even spoke. I braced myself. Nora said she did not know how true any of it was, but Lena said my family was going through a hard time because I had cut them off, financially. Lena said my dad had been hurt deeply after everything he had done for me. She said I had changed since opening the boutique, and that money had gone to my head. I froze for a moment, then asked Nora if that was all. She hesitated. Then she added that Lena had said I had become cold and selfish, that I had abandoned the people who raised me, that I had refused to help them, even though I had more than enough. I sat down slowly on the stool behind me. The room felt smaller, like the air had thickened. I asked Nora what she told Lena. She said she told her nothing. She simply changed the subject. She said she did not believe a word of it. She said she knew me, but the fact that she had heard it at all meant the story had already left them. House. It had reached the sidewalks of Westfield. It had reached the parking lots. It had reached the grocery aisles. And now it has reached my store. That night after closing, I checked my phone again. There were more messages. Some from acquaintances I barely remembered. A few asked if everything was all right. A few danced around the edges of gossip. One simply said, "Your family must be so hurt." I put the phone down and walked into the kitchen. I opened the fridge, stared at the shelves, closed it again without taking anything. My hands were shaking, not from fear, not from anger, from recognition. I knew exactly what was happening. My family was rewriting the story. They were turning my boundary into betrayal. They were turning my silence into arrogance. They were turning my freeze into cruelty. And they were doing it with the same ease they had once used to ask me for money. I sat on the sofa and let the truth settle like dust in a sunbeam. For years, they had needed me only in the ways that benefited them. Now that I no longer filled that role, they needed something else from me. They needed a story that made sense to them, a story where they were good, loyal, deserving. And I was the problem. The next afternoon, while arranging candles near the front window, I heard a soft knock on the glass. I looked up and saw Lydia, one of my regular customers, standing outside with her scarf pulled tightly around her neck. She was in her early 60s, kind, thoughtful, one of those women who always asked how I was doing and waited for a real answer. I unlocked the door and let her in. She lingered by the counter longer than usual after paying for a set of mugs. Then she cleared her throat and said she hoped she was not overstepping, but she had heard something earlier in the day that did not sit right with her. She said she had run into a man in the parking lot of the hardware store, someone who knew my family. He had said he felt bad for my parents, that I had become unpredictable, that I had cut ties with them out of nowhere. He said I was acting out. He said maybe I was struggling mentally and did not realize it. I felt something inside me go very still. Lydia looked at me gently, her eyes steady. She said she did not believe that version for a second. She said nothing about me had ever suggested instability or impulsiveness. She said I was grounded, thoughtful, and intentional. She said she had known enough people in crisis to know I was not one of them. Her words did not erase the sting, but they anchored me. I thanked her quietly. She touched my arm before leaving and told me she hoped I would not let other people's stories become my truth. After she left, I locked the front door, even though it was still daylight. I turned the sign to close and leaned my forehead against the cool surface of the glass. Outside, people walked by without looking in. Cars passed. Life in Dublin continued unbothered, but inside my chest, a different world was forming. A world where I finally saw the cost of letting people shape me without my permission. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and a pen. I did not write anything. I just opened the pages and looked at the empty lines. I thought about the years of giving, the years of silence, the years of stepping into the versions of myself they preferred, the versions that demanded nothing, questioned nothing, wanted nothing. The lies spreading across Westfield did not surprise me. Not really. They were simply the natural evolution of people who needed the story to twist in their favor. If they admitted the truth, they would have to admit what they did to me. They would have to admit the years of taking. They would have to admit the refusal to help when I needed it. So they created a narrative where I was greedy, where I was unstable, where I was ungrateful, where I had suddenly turned into a different person. But the truth was much simpler. I had stopped performing, and they did not know who I was without that performance. My phone buzzed again that night, but I ignored it. I no longer needed to respond. Not to defend myself, not to correct the rumors, not to rescue the image they preferred. Silence was its own kind of answer. Around 10 in the evening, I heard a soft knock at my apartment door. My heart jumped, thinking for a moment that one of them might have shown up. But when I opened the door, it was my neighbor from across the hall, an older woman named Helen. She held a small plate of cookies and said she had made too many. She asked if I wanted some. I took them, thanked her, and asked how she was doing. She smiled and said she had heard a little about my family situation, but that she hoped I was taking care of myself. She said sometimes people who benefit from you will always claim the loudest version of the truth. She said the only thing that matters is who you are when no one is watching. After she left, I sat on the sofa with the plate beside me. The apartment felt soft and warm. My body felt tired in a way that was beginning to feel familiar, like I was shedding something heavy without knowing how long it had been attached to me. I realized then that I did not need to explain myself, not to the people repeating the lies, not to the ones willing to believe them without question, not even to the ones pretending to be concerned. The story they were spreading was not my responsibility to correct. The truth would come out on its own, maybe slowly, maybe painfully, but inevitably. I leaned back against the cushions and looked at the ceiling, letting the room settle around me. The lies had left the house. They were walking through the town, but they were not walking through me, not anymore. And somewhere deep beneath the noise, a new certainty began to take root. I did not need to defend my story. I only needed to keep living it. That quiet truth stayed with me over the next week, even as the ripples from the freeze kept spreading outward, slow and steady, touching places I had not expected. Karma does not arrive in dramatic thunder. It arrives in paperwork, declined transactions, and the collapse of promises people thought would never be tested. The first real sign came 3 days after Christmas. I was restocking a shelf of winter candles at the Willow Fern when my phone buzzed with an email notification. I glanced at the screen and saw a name I did not recognize at first. Calvin Rowe. It took a moment before it clicked. He was the local attorney in Westfield who handled small claims, property disputes, and the occasional family mediation. I remembered seeing his name on signs around town when I was growing up. My stomach tightened as I opened the email. It was short, written in careful, neutral language. He said he had been contacted by someone representing a family member about what they believed to be a misunderstanding involving shared accounts and access to funds. He asked if I would be available for a conversation to clarify the situation. He said he was confident there was a simple explanation. I read the email twice. Then I set my phone down slowly on the counter. Calvin was not a threat, but his involvement meant something. It meant the story my family had spun had reached a point where they were seeking validation. Someone had convinced him that I had taken something that did not belong to me, or that I had frozen something without their permission, or that I had jeopardized their stability. Someone had tried to turn the consequences of their own actions into a legal question. I stood there for a long moment, the soft scent of cinnamon candles drifting around me. I felt neither fear nor anger, just a quiet confirmation of what I already knew. They were desperate to regain control of the narrative. Desperate enough to drag in a lawyer. Desperate enough to pretend the money they had taken from me over years was somehow theirs by right. I wrote back politely, thanking him for reaching out, and explained the truth clearly. The account was mine alone, no joint owners, no shared access, no misunderstanding, and the decision to freeze it was a personal financial choice. I told him there was nothing to discuss. He replied an hour later, apologizing for the intrusion and wishing me well. The legal thread snapped cleanly, but the consequences continued to spread. 2 days later, on a cold gray morning, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Rowan had lost his apartment after falling behind on rent. He had relied on the quiet assumption that I would step in again. He had told people he was not worried. He said he had support. When that support vanished, reality hit him with a kind of force he had never prepared for. The landlord locked the door on his unit and placed his belongings in storage. He moved in temporarily with a friend on the east side of Westfield. I felt no satisfaction when I heard it, only a dull ache. Rowan had spent years living in a world where his consequences fell onto me. Losing that safety net must have felt like free fall. But I did not rush to help. The instinct that once guided me so easily had gone silent. I let the truth settle. He was an adult. He was capable of solving his own problems, and if he was not, it was because he had chosen not to learn how. Bethany's unraveling came more quietly. She had mentioned for months that her husband was on track for a promotion. That was the story she used the day she asked me for money in that coffee shop, years earlier. But now I heard from someone who knew someone who worked at her husband's company that the promotion had never been guaranteed. And after her spending habits caught up with them, the debt they had hidden for years finally surfaced. Her card being declined on Christmas night had been the first clue. A week later, she tried to apply for a small loan and was denied. The bank saw the freeze on my account and flagged their request. It was not my fault, but she blamed me anyway. She sent me a long message filled with accusations, claiming I had sabotaged her life, that I had put her family in danger, that I had abandoned her when she had only ever wanted the best for me. She wrote that I had become unrecognizable. I did not respond. Responding would have only fed the story she was trying to keep alive. Dad's consequences came last, but they came with the weight of someone who had built his entire identity on control. For years, he had used my support as a buffer for his poor business decisions. The construction jobs he took on were inconsistent. His cash flow had always been tight, but the freeze cut off the patch he had depended on. A week after Christmas, one of his suppliers refused to continue work until he paid. An overdue invoice. Another withheld materials. Dad had never been good at humility. Asking for extensions was not something he did gracefully. One evening, as I was closing the boutique, I overheard a conversation outside. 2 women were walking past, bundled in heavy coats, holding coffee cups. They mentioned my dad by name and said his business was in trouble again. One of them said he had been counting on money that fell through. The other said she had heard that his own daughter had turned her back on him, leaving him to fend for himself. They walked on without realizing I was standing just inside the window. I locked the door and let the latch click softly. I did not feel anger. I did not feel the need to correct them. I simply felt distance. The kind of distance that forms when you finally understand a truth you had been avoiding. That my family had built their lives around the assumption that I would always show up. And when I stopped, the structure they built around me cracked. Meanwhile, The willow fern quietly settled into its own rhythm. After the holiday rush, there was a slow, steady flow of regular customers. People came in seeking comfort items, small gifts, and warm scents for their homes. Nora took on more responsibility, managing inventory spreadsheets and chatting easily with visitors while I organized shipments. There was a calmness in the store that I had never found anywhere else. A grounding, a reminder that I had built something real from the pieces of myself I had kept, protected. One afternoon, while arranging a new display of ceramic bowls from a local artist, I caught myself smiling. A simple, genuine smile. The kind that comes when you realize your world has not collapsed after all. It had only shifted. And the shift had made space for something better. Later that week, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Calvin, the attorney. He apologized again for the confusion and assured me that he had clarified the matter with the family member who had contacted him. He wrote that he hoped the new year brought me peace. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer. Not because I needed to keep it, but because it represented something important, proof that the truth did not need defense. It only needed time. The days that followed were calm. My phone still buzzed occasionally with messages from my family, but the frequency slowed. The tone changed too. The anger softened into guilt, then into silence. The smear efforts continued around Westfield, but they lost their heat. People moved on. Whispers faded. New gossip took their place. And somewhere in that quiet stretch of winter, a realization settled into me with a kind of gentle certainty. I did not need to reclaim the money I had given. I did not need apologies. I did not need the truth to be shouted from rooftops or posted on bulletin boards or proved through any dramatic confrontation. The only thing I needed was to stop rescuing people who had built their lives around using me. Freedom was not always loud. Sometimes it arrived in silence. Sometimes it arrived in the steady hum of a boutique you built with your own two hands. Sometimes it arrived in the understanding that you could let the consequences fall where they belonged, without stepping in to soften the impact. One evening, as I locked up the store and stepped into the crisp air, I felt a calm I had not felt in years. The streetlights glowed softly on the pavement. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky. My breath rose in small white puffs, and I realized that karma had done its work without me raising a hand. I walked to my car, the keys warm in my palm, and paused for a moment before opening the door. Not rescuing them was enough, and for the first time, enough felt like power. That calm carried me through the early days of January, even as the air sharpened and the sidewalks in Dublin grew slick with frost. I settled back into the rhythm of the willow fern, opening the shop in the mornings, greeting customers, letting the soft glow of the lamps and the warm scent of cedar and bergamot steady me. Life felt smaller in a comforting way, contained, manageable, mine. But peace has a way of asking whether you are ready for its final test. Mine arrived in the form of a voicemail. It was a Friday evening. The store had just closed. I was counting cash at the counter when my phone buzzed. I ignored it at first, assuming it was another spam call. But when I glanced at the screen, I saw my mom's number. She had not called since the night I froze the account. For a moment, I expected the same guilt-soaked tone she always used. But when the voicemail icon appeared, something in me tightened. I pressed play. Her voice was softer than usual, almost formal. She said she hoped I was well. She said she and Dad wanted to meet. She said they thought it was time to talk. No anger, no blame, no dramatic pleas. Just a request. I listened twice before locking up the store. The sky outside had turned a pale shade of lavender, the kind the Midwest gets in winter before the sun disappears completely. I drove home thinking about what the meeting might be, what they might want, what I was willing to give. By the next morning, I knew I would go, not out of obligation, not to fix anything, but because closure requires a full stop, not a fade out. And I was ready to put down the last stone I had been carrying. We agreed to meet Sunday afternoon at my parents' house in Westfield. I parked across the street, the same spot I used in high school when I came home late from work shifts. The house looked the same, but the feeling did not. The porch light glowed faintly. A strand of Christmas lights still hung along the railing, though half had gone out. I walked to the door and knocked gently. My mom opened it almost immediately. She looked smaller somehow. Her shoulders were pulled in, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. But when she smiled, the smile did not reach her eyes. She stepped aside, letting me in. The living room was tidy, almost staged. The couch pillows were arranged neatly, the coffee table cleared. Dad sat in his recliner, hands clasped tightly, jaw set in a tense line. He nodded once when I walked in, a gesture that attempted civility, but landed somewhere colder. I sat on the far end of the couch. No hugs, no small talk, no questions about my store or my life. They sat across from me as if we were three people who had met for a business discussion, not a family. Mom folded her hands on her lap. She took a breath and began. "We know things have been strained," she said gently, "and we want to understand what is going on with you." I held her gaze. There was no confusion in her voice, no true desire to understand. She wanted an opening, a place to insert the version of the story that kept them blameless. I told her I had already explained. I needed my money. I had asked politely. They refused. So I made a decision based on that. David shifted in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. "You blindsided us," he said. His voice was flat, like he had rehearsed this line. "You froze everything without warning. Do you have any idea what that did to us?" I met his eyes. "Yes. And I also know you had years of warning every time you chose to borrow without returning anything." His jaw tightened. "This is not like you," he said. "You are acting out of anger, out of pride. This store of yours has changed you." I did not flinch. The store did not change me. It revealed who I was when I was not giving everything away. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. That account was our safety net. We depended on it. I exhaled slowly. The words were simple truths. It was not your net, it was mine. Mom reached out as if to touch my hand, then pulled back like she thought better of it. Her eyes filled with tears that felt staged, but maybe they were real. I never could tell. "Honey, we did not want it to come to this. But we need help, real help. Things have gotten worse since the holidays. Your dad is behind on business payments. Rowan is struggling, and Bethany's situation is complicated." I waited. I knew the real request was coming. Mom's voice trembled. "If you could release the freeze, even just temporarily, we could fix everything. We could start fresh. We could rebuild our relationship." There it was. Not reconciliation, not reflection. Money. Always money. I folded my hands in my lap, mirroring her posture. Then I said the clearest sentence I had spoken since the night of Christmas dinner. "I am not unfreezing the account." Silence fell across the room. Heavy, immediate. My dad's face hardened. My mom's breath caught. Dad spoke first. His voice grew sharp, edged with something cold. "You would let your own family drown rather than give back what was never meant to. Be yours alone." It was an astonishing sentence, not because it was cruel, but because he believed it, truly believed it. I stood up slowly. My legs felt steady beneath me. "I am done being your solution," I said. "I am done being your resource. I am done giving while you take and rewrite the story in your favor. I asked for help one time in my entire life, and you punished me for it." Mom stood too, hands shaking. "We are not punishing you. We are asking for help as a family. Families help each other." I looked at her, really looked at her. For the first time, I understood that her definition of family had never included boundaries, only sacrifice. And I had been the designated sacrifice for years. "No," I said softly. "Families help each other." But I was the only one helping. Dad stood next, shoulders squared. "If you walk out that door, you are choosing money over family." I felt something inside me go still. A clarity, sharper than anger, cleaner than grief. "No," I said. "I am choosing myself." He let out a bitter laugh. "Then you are no daughter of mine." The words hung in the air, heavy and familiar, not because I had heard them before, but because I had sensed them long before they were spoken. He had loved the version of me that required nothing, not the person I had become. Mom whispered my name, as if that would pull me back, as if history alone could undo truth. I stepped back toward the doorway. "This was your choice," I said, "not mine." David's voice cut through the room one last time, colder than the winter outside. "Do not come back here asking for anything." I nodded. "I never will." I walked toward the front door. My coat felt heavier on my shoulders as I slipped it on. My mom called out again, her voice breaking. I paused for a moment, hand on the doorknob, waiting to see if there would be an apology, a moment of clarity, a shift in the tone. Anything, but the only sound was my dad's angry breathing behind her. I opened the door. The cold air rushed in, brushing against my face, sharp and honest. I stepped outside and closed it gently behind me. The porch creaked beneath my feet. Snowflakes drifted down, soft and quiet. I walked down the driveway, feeling the weight of their final words settle somewhere inside me, not as a wound, but as a truth I had already accepted. That was the last time I was ever called a daughter. And walking back to my car, I knew I would never answer that word in their voices again. The cold settled around me as I walked to my car, but inside my chest something felt strangely quiet, like the air after a long storm finally decided to rest. I started the engine and pulled away from the house without looking back. The windows of my childhood home glowed behind me, but they felt like lights belonging to strangers. The drive back to Dublin was surprisingly gentle. The roads were clear, the sky wide and pale, and for the first time in months, I felt the tension in my shoulders loosen. I had expected grief to hit me like a wave. Instead, there was only a sense of clarity, as if something inside me had finally realigned. Life settled into a new rhythm in the weeks that followed. The willow fern moved through the tail end of winter with a steadiness that surprised me. Customers wandered wrapped in scarves and thick coats, their faces pink from the cold. They picked up candles, felt the softness of knit blankets, and asked about new pieces from local artists. The store felt warm and lived in. It felt loved. It felt like a place built from the parts of me that had never belonged to anyone else. One afternoon in late February, I stood near the counter with a fresh shipment of pottery. The light coming through the front windows made the glaze shimmer in shades of soft green and cream. Nora walked in from the back, carrying boxes and humming under her breath. She caught me staring at the display and saw the distant look on my face. "You all right?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes, I think I am." She smiled, the kind of smile that lets silence settle comfortably. We moved through the shop together, arranging shelves and updating price tags. There was something healing about the simplicity of those tasks, the way small actions could stitch together a day. Later that evening, when the shop was quiet and the last customer had left, I sat on the stool behind the counter and opened my notebook. For weeks, I had been trying to put into words the truth of what had happened, not to explain it to anyone else, but to see it clearly for myself. I wrote one sentence, then another, and slowly, the truth that had lived beneath everything finally became visible. The $1.2 million I told my family about had never been my full lottery win. It was only the part I chose to share and the part I chose to lose. I closed the notebook and placed my hand on top of it. The truth felt solid, clean, not a weapon, not a boast, just a fact I had finally earned the right to say out loud, even if only to myself. When I won $10.8 million back in 2019, I could have kept it all hidden. I could have shut everyone out completely. But at the time, I believed sharing my luck would strengthen our bond. I believed showing generosity would bring us closer. I believed love grew from giving. Instead, giving had revealed the truth, not about money, but about loyalty, about expectation, about the difference between being loved for who you are and being valued for what you provide. What I lost was not just money. I lost the illusion of who my family was. I lost the fantasy that they would someday see me fully. I lost the hope that love alone could fix what was broken long before I ever held a winning ticket. But what I gained was quieter and infinitely more powerful. I gained myself. As winter thinned into early spring, The willow fern settled into a steady pulse. The store had good months and slower ones, but each week felt more stable than the last. I learned to trust my instincts. I learned to breathe through uncertainty. I learned to choose myself without apology. Sometimes customers would linger and talk to me about their lives. Divorce, estranged siblings, children who no longer called, parents who never learned how to see them. I listened, recognizing the familiar ache behind their stories. The ache of being overlooked in the place you needed to matter most. One Saturday afternoon, a woman in her 60s stood by the candle display and said something I never forgot. She said family is not who loves you the loudest, it is who loves you the longest. I carried that line with me long after she walked out the door. In late March, I received a message from a childhood friend named Tessa. She said she had run into my mom at the grocery store and that my mom had looked tired, almost faded. She said she hoped things would eventually smooth out between us. I thanked her, but inside, I knew smoothing out was no longer the goal. Peace was not always a reunion. Sometimes peace was distant. Sometimes it was choosing not to reopen a wound that only healed because you stopped touching it. One night, after closing the shop, I sat alone on the floor with a mug of tea, watching the lights outside flicker across the walls. The store looked beautiful, warm, and steady, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had built a home out of my own choices instead of other people's expectations. I realized then that losing my family had not broken me. It has clarified me. I had spent years believing I needed to earn my place within their world, but the truth was simpler. I had never belonged to their story. I only played a role they needed, until I no longer did. Now I belong to myself, and that was enough. Sometimes customers asked me if I still talk to my family. I told them the truth. Not often, not really. Not anymore. Most people nodded with quiet understanding. A few looked surprised, but almost everyone said some version of the same thing. Sometimes distance is healthier than apology. On the first warm day of spring, I unlocked the shop early and stood for a moment at the doorway, letting the fresh air drift through. The sun felt gentle on my face. The trees along the street were just starting to bud. Life was moving forward, as it always does. I thought about what I had lost. Not a family, but the dream of one. Not money, but the belief that giving would save us. Not love, but the illusion of what love had looked like in that house. Then I thought about what I had gained. Self-respect, stability, clarity, my own voice. A life built from choices instead of guilt. That trade was worth everything. Tonight, as I sit in my apartment, the soft lamp glowing beside me, I can finally tell my story without shaking, without doubting myself, without wondering what others might think. I tell it the way it happened. I tell it the way I lived it. And I tell it with the sense of peace that comes from choosing truth over silence. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.